Oh, and good evening. It's December 12th, 2024, and welcome back to another season, another episode of Sons of the Father. We're continuing our discussions on The Chosen, Season 4, of course, created by Dallas Jenkins. And tonight, we're going to continue exploring Season 4, Episode 7, The Last Sign. This is our Part 2. Because during this series, my dad, John Wern, my brother, Jim Wern, and of course myself, we're going to converse, reflect on things that have impacted us. You all get to listen in. So welcome to the Sons of the Father on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. But the reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. And all of our video discussion series on everything that we talk about, they can all be found on TheDustyFeet.com. So, The Last Sign, Part 2. Again, a reminder, we must remember, this is a storyteller's story. It's not a reaccounting. Okay, Part 2. So, where do you want to go from here?
Yeah. I think it's more than going somewhere, it's chasing them. And not so much going on. It's all the emotions that are happening in that when he brings them out of the tomb, and you can imagine his accountant and his business manager thinking all kinds of crazy things, when you put real life into it.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus was so tender with Laz, and he's of course totally confused. What the heck is going on? You had a 4-day nap, just very. The conversation was very casual, and I don't know what if I don't. I've never seen a miracle, as I said before. I've talked to people that have seen miracles, and they told me about them. So I don't know how I would react if I saw something like that. And there's so many people watching this, meaning that the crowd was so varied, from close friends to neighbors to people just coming to watch. The one guy over in the corner that you never, at least I didn't figure out. I don't think anybody sent him. I think he was there to take back info to the Pharisees and all. But it's just a fascinating episode overall. And this second part with Mary going back and forth to their modern day when she and Matthew are talking in the cave, and then back to the actual happening. There's so many different sub stories happening. What are some of the things you saw, Jim?
I think what was interesting, we saw Thomas's struggle, and Jesus explaining as best he could, which was, you'll understand in time. This is not something you're going to get right now. But the fact that he said, because it's time, it was a juncture in Jesus's journey where the shift is happening. And before he couldn't, because it wasn't time yet. And so kind of watching that, but then also, like we were talking about the different reactions of people. You had some that were elated, some that were confused, some that were angry, some that were afraid, because here's a dead man walking. And all of those emotions are legit emotions. Every one of them, has a reason for why. And sometimes I think we try to, well, come on, it's a miracle. Jesus just raised somebody from the dead. Be excited. It's like, and I think Jesus was letting them catch up as well. I think he was, you could definitely see the disappointment in that he kind of wished they were further along in their faith of trusting what he was doing. But I think, for where we're at in the story, obviously, like he said to Thomas, in time you'll understand. And I think the same thing with other people as well. Bob, I saw that look on your face. What was that?
Yeah.
Well, I just got one. What he said to them, you'll understand, is like me talking to you guys when you were young and saying, you'll understand when you get older.
Yeah.
And it's just as it
I
falls
hate
on
that
deaf
answer.
ears because I'm not older and I don't understand.
Right. Exactly.
Well, Dad, that's a very good point. That's a legitimate point in that, because part of it is there has to be maturity to it. Part of it is that there's points of life that you don't understand.
Right.
You really don't have a grasp or full appreciation of what it takes to create life and what it takes to end life. And you don't know. You using this in this example that we're talking about here, but in that, you won't understand till you're older or that time has played out. Jimmy, on the faith thing, and I struggle with this myself, so that's why the quizzical deal is that what do we have in the past that gives them any indication that they should be looking for a prophet that raises people from the dead, and that this is something that they should expect, and I'm going to use some very weird verbiage here that's probably going to bother people, okay? But the other time that we saw a series of miracles that we'll argue, say, built up in severity, okay? And because we have the flip at the end where we have death as the ultimate severity in the 10, Egypt, okay? A past. And the last one being, of course, the ultimate in death, where we have Jesus's miracle and we have life in two different forms. One, he raises Lazarus, and two, his own. Okay, so a juxtaposition of this. But I don't. Sometimes in our faith, we tend to say that sometimes, and yet I go, why? Why in the world would they have that? Now, we maybe could be more mature along that way. But like Dad, like you just said about wait till you're older, maybe it's one of those history lessons. Wait till you're 1,000 years down the road, 2,000 years down the road, and maybe you should be more mature than they are in this story, of which I'll bite, because I think Jesus was expecting them to be a bit more mature in their personal walks than they would have been the previous 1,000 years before. Fair? Right. In other words, they've gone from David to the diaspora. Okay, in between Jesus, right? You have David and the pinnacle of Jewish history, where you have their greatest king ever, and the land is profiting. It's a wonderful place to be. He's dancing. He's brought the tabernacle and the ark into Jerusalem. I mean, there's a lot of things that go on in here. That ride up on the donkey is reminiscent of those things, and I got a feeling we're going to get an echo to do that in the future. But we have this point. Why would they believe that now? Why should they be expectation? Why to me this would scare you, and because you're not sure. It's staggering. Today, we see people resuscitated all the time, right? We have TV shows. People are pumped and resuscitated. They were dead. People telling stories about being dead for however long. I like soccer. I see resurrections at least 4 or 5 a game. So it's become almost satirical in its muted behavior. Back then, it's a very different scale. So maybe sometimes we're kind of hard on them. I say thought, and with that is that we're on where they could or should have been. Yeah. But still, I agree that in that they're not there yet. But Jesus is hoping, Jimmy, your point's very well. I want you to get there eventually. Yeah. And they don't realize what's coming down the pack, and that they're going to see more. Yeah. So
he's I think Jesus is, at least the way that he's being portrayed here, is a little disappointed that they aren't
Mm-hmm.
further
Fair.
along. He wishes that they were um, further along, that they would grasp them. He gets in a conversation with Lazarus, and he talks about that. The one of the scenes that I thought was touching was Mary at the tomb. When everybody was gone, she was there all by herself, and she goes over and peeks in, looks down at the wrappings on the ground, and touches the stone that's rolled. She couldn't possibly know what's going to happen, but there's something that's stirring inside of her. It's happened to me where I've been in places and I said, this seems interesting. And I can't put my finger on it at the time, but it's almost giving me a picture of what could be later. And that I just thought that was a very interesting little shot of Mary, considering she's the one that discovered him at the tomb. So
Well, I think we see that we're going to maybe see a little of that scene reflected in her psalm that we'll talk about at the end. I think, Dad, you're getting the point. That she's been in a dark place and she came into the light, but it's her life where she was in the darkest of places, and so she has as close to that type of event as anybody. At least in the Dallas story, especially. And it's fair to say that if we understand Scripture story right, that there's a validity to part of that storytelling. And she's kind of maybe reflecting on that a bit, that it's a reminder, and a sobering reminder maybe even of this in a very, because you would think, in this, Dad, you made the point that you would think because they just raised him from the dead, this would just be a big party.
Yeah.
But it's not. Not the way he's telling the story here. The way Dallas is telling the story here, we're seeing another twist, thought. Yeah.
Well, and part of the disciples want it to be a party. This is Judas is leading the band. He says, "Are you kidding me? This is what all these people saw. They're going to run back. They're going to tell. We're going to mix with the big dogs, and we're going to make this thing happen."
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got 12 guys with 12 different backgrounds and 12 different personalities, all well, you got 14 counting Mary and her pal there. But I just think and then Lazarus' sisters sitting around the table, because they don't know it. They're not talking with Jesus, where Jesus is trying to explain some things to Lazarus. So there's so many stories inside of stories that Dallas is going crazy with. I think this is the most I've seen yet. But going back to what we said in the beginning, beginning was, this is Dallas's interpretation of what happened outside of what he read in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And would I have done it that way? I have no idea. But I'm enjoying the stories within stories that he has come up with. Jim?
Well, I think the interweaving, we've seen it in other places, either of past and then present being, the life of Jesus at the moment, and then future, which we saw in this episode with Matthew and Mary, and then look back kinds of things. I like those kinds of connections.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob, you mentioned it, and I think it probably would be a good time to talk about Mary's song, because I think we're going to have some discussion regarding it. So if you want to lead into that, go ahead.
Okay, I can take us there. Let me click a few buttons here, get us to that point. Okay, so this is Mary's psalm from and I this is word for word, but now it's about inflection, and so I'll do my best to justify the choice. So, darkness is not the absence of light. That would be too simple. It's more uncontrollable, sinister. Not the place, but the void. I was there once, more than once. Although I could not see or hear you, you were there, waiting. Because the darkness is not dark to you, at least not always. You wept, not because your friend was dead, but because soon you would be. And because we couldn't understand it, or didn't want to, or both. The coming darkness was too deep for us to grasp. But then, so was the light. One had to come before the other. It was always that way with you. It still is. Tears fell from your eyes, and then ours, before every light in the world went out. And time itself wanted to die with you. I go back to that place sometimes. Or rather, it comes back to me, uninvited. The night that was eternal. Until it wasn't. Bitter. And then sweet. But somehow, the bitter remained in the sweet. It's never gone away. You told us it would be like that. Not with your words, but with how you lived. The man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. That grief wasn't what we wanted to see, so we tried to look away. And in so doing, fulfilled your very essence. One from whom people hide their faces. But soon, we couldn't hide from it anymore. And then we couldn't stop the sun from setting or rising. I remember wishing you were there, that there could be another way. And looking back, I do too. I still don't know why it has to be this way. The bitter often mingled with the sweet. Maybe I never will. At least on this side of. So she has her dark place, and she's reflecting on this time, and she's equating it to and lining it up with this introduction of feelings. Oh, Dad, your point on there, it's an introduction of feeling. And she is saying, I've been there. And Dad, like the memoirs that you're writing, there's the point where you say, and then there was Jesus. We want to try sometimes and take that with the good, and we get that. And sometimes it'll be on the not so good parts, and he's there. And she is taking it even more on the, even when I didn't see you, even in that point, even before. And this is on that darker side, but you can't have one without the other. And that's one of those things that we balance with, is having one without the other. And we feel sometimes that we always ask to get out of certain things. At the same time, he tells you that's the way it is. That's life. And so we have that point. Hence the way they're living, Andrew. And that's goes back, takes you right to the beginning of the story. Takes you right back to there where Matthew is seeking out Mary to tell her about the death of a very man who spent his life in pain. In the story, in pain. And so now at least he's not in pain anymore. And his death wasn't pretty. We have history to tell us that one. on this calm before the storm. Yeah, that's gonna come up. So now from there, guys, what do you got?
I just thought that his conversation with Lazarus was very touching and revealing, even of the what's to come. And Lazarus says, "You're scaring me," and that's the if I was there, I would have felt the same way. That because you're getting it from what you're just saying right now is you're going to die. And he just got the twist of it. He didn't have any idea how he was going to die, but Lazarus is starting to in this conversation again. This is Dallas's rendition of it, but I picture myself in several of these scenes and saying, where would I be with that? That's probably where I'd be. And if I was with Thomas, oh man, would I be with him? If I saw him healing somebody else and not healing the person that I loved, it would be very, and Peter too.
Yeah.
And they're not at this point. They're not highlighting Peter, but I remember when we used to give, when I was involved in giving wheelchairs away, and you were out, or you just didn't have something that would fit someone, they would get angry at us and as a group, or whoever was doing it. What do you mean you're out? Well, I want to be at the top of the list the next time you come. And all of those things that are just natural, that you would react that way. I don't find myself upset with Thomas at all. I'm wondering why he even hung around, which Jesus says to him, I hope you stick around. I hope you stay with it so you can see the whole story. But at the time, we couldn't explain it.
Yeah.
And he couldn't explain it. That's why I think he didn't really try. He said a few things, but he didn't really try.
Yeah.
Jimmy?
Listening to that psalm, and I like that you call it a psalm. I think it definitely is. And I think more of us should write those, the Psalms were literally just reflections of where people were at the time. A lot of them were David, but there were sons of Korah and other ones that wrote Psalms, and they were always very real and raw and honest to God in terms of what they felt, both the anger, frustration, and also the joy and elation. And to hear Mary, language-wise, it probably was a little more modern language of today than it would have been back then. But catching the essence or heart of, like you said, Bob, she was somebody who would understand the darkness and almost this life of death that she has been resurrected to a new life. Yeah. And so it was a beautiful expression of watching that. And I loved when she said that darkness isn't dark to you. Yeah. And that's scriptural. Yeah. And that's true, in terms of as we understand God, when we are in those deep, dark places, he's there. And his discussion with Lazarus, talking about, the experience that he just had. I liked it because it was more personal than it was. Yeah. This is spiritual revelation of, an image of what's going to come, even though he does talk about that. It was still more, what was it like kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I liked that part of it, but it was, I don't know, just reflecting on Mary's psalm, there, the heart of where she was at.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you see that throughout. It's like when you're watching, and Jesus interacting with, she's somebody who is, of anybody who gets it, she probably gets it the most.
Right.
In terms of the way Dallas is portraying her. We
Right.
don't know, obviously, scripturally, whether that was the case or not. But it's interesting to see the varying degrees. You've got
Mm-hmm.
Mary, who's kind of looking more at the deeper aspect of what was going on, and then Thomas, who is just in anguish of why not
Mm-hmm.
Rhema.
Mm-hmm.
Both ends of the spectrum going on there, and everything in between. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that was visually beautiful when Dallas, during Mary's psalm, all these images of everybody processing, everybody kind of dealing with what they were feeling.
Mm-hmm.
You got bouncing back and forth with all of that in the midst of her song. Was visually beautiful as the words were beautiful. So it was fun to watch.
There's, it's, spoiler alert, because he dies, comes back, and leaves again, right? So this is Mary's in the point past all of that. So when she's with Matthew, because I think we have our churchy way of thinking of things. We always go with, and he's risen and he's there, and we get all the happy. And it's interesting because the story that you read afterwards and the church history that goes with it is a mix. And again, what we catch with Mary's psalm is you have the bitter and then the sweet, but the bitter doesn't go away. It's that subtle note. For those that have wine or something like that aftertaste, that flowing deal. There's certain foods, certain cheeses and things that will give an aftertaste afterwards. You get out, and so it doesn't really leave you. It lingers on the tongue. And I think we have this here, and we go, the sadness of what we're going to approach in this story, and then the joy that we're going to have in the story, but then the departure. Mary's on the departure end when she's saying her psalm to Matthew. They're on the departure end. So this Messiah that Judas, we know, wants in this story. We don't go, oh, it's going to get there eventually. Judas will sort this all out. That doesn't happen. And all of this stuff doesn't play out. And then he comes back, great. And then within 50 days, he's gone again. And we're back to today, 2,000 years later, right? And this is part of those discussions that we have in this. And Jesus said, well, what does that look like? And he kept reminding them, just like he did Judas, when they're walking on that road. What did he say? He said, where did we meet? And Judas goes, on the plains of Chorazin. That's the hill, the mount, right? And he goes, think about it. So I'd say the same thing here. Go back to the Sermon on the Mount and see what you get. And then we're going to see how this story unfolds ultimately and all that kind of stuff. Why we have the series, the Sermon on the Mount. Why it's a major topic of discussion, because Jesus keeps pointing us back to that. Dallas Jenkins does it in the story, but he's on this particular point. I'll applaud him because that's what Jesus kept doing. And he's reminding us to do the exact same thing. Funny enough, we don't seem to see that as strongly as we should in the writings of Peter and Paul and all those points where they're referring to that very point. Those of you that weren't on the Mount, let me share with you what that can look like. And it's going to look a little different in Jerusalem. It's going to look a little different in Corinth. It's going to look a little different in Galatia. It's going to in Ephesus, right? It's going to look a little different in these places, in Philippi. But what's underneath. And so that you made that point that we see them walking this out, and this is a short-term view. Judas is very short-term in his view, and Mary's psalm here is showing the length of that and the lingering of the flavors. Yeah, and Jimmy, I think that's right. I think it's one of the reasons why I enjoyed where she took that so much, where her character, Dallas's writers, took us with this.
What I getting out of it, one of the things I'm getting out of it is back in those days, all they talked about was Jesus and what he did. And what the church has gotten away from today is they talk about all kinds of stuff. Jesus is included in it, but maybe this weekend it's politics, or this weekend it's a fundraiser, or this weekend we're preparing to go to Honduras on a mission. It's in those days, all they talked about was Jesus and that he died for our sins and he died for you and he loves you. And that was it. They didn't make promises that if you accept him, life is going to be easy or any of those kind of things. And I've said it myself, but I hear people saying all the time, why did the church grow? If you became a Christian, they fed you to the lions. If you what was the times that I've spent in China? China's got one of the fastest growing church populations, Jesus populations, because they're up against it. And here you've got it too easy. Well, I'm going to get off on a different horse, and that doesn't make any sense. I just really like the fact that that's what Jesus was, I think, trying to say with Lazarus and trying to say with them, is that it's all about what's going to happen to me and why I'm doing it.
And my question, that maybe this is one of those hanging questions. It's not going to be able to answer it tonight. We're out of time, but it's that thought of Jesus gave them some things to think about. I don't believe it was to think about him other than use him as an example. Does that make sense? In other words, his Sermon on the Mount wasn't talk about me. It's, well, go read Sermon on the Mount. Tell me what it talks about. And so I think we have a different deal because he said he's talking about the Father. So if we want to talk about Jesus and we don't mention the Father, I think that's more food for discussion. And Dad, maybe you have a point. Maybe the church in that has lost that connection, that the Son is only talking about the Father, and we kind of skip that. And I think that's dangerous territory, personally. But in that point of discussion are we talking about those kind of things, which is fun. And it does. It lets us look at our lives, and it looks at the examples of these lives and how they lived and what they talked about, what they shared, in other words, because these are glimpses. We have a smattering of history. We have Paul by reputation in a story that we really don't know about unless we go to secular history to find out about Paul. Or we don't know. The audience then is intimately familiar with Paul, intimately familiar with him, the followers that are with him, and the mentor that taught him. That's like trying to mention somebody famous today. They go, everybody knows that name. Like him or hate him, everybody knows that name. They're aware of that. It's us that gets caught on the back foot. And then whatever somebody told you about somebody, then we have this, and they talk nice about him. I said, do you really know about him? Do you really know about him? And where we're at 2,000 years later, I do love that Dad, do get to talk about Jesus. But we also remember that we're not having this discussion if it weren't for him saying, look, my dad's the key. always
Amen.
has been, because Jesus doesn't raise himself. So, and where we're going to with that, and where this story in Mary talks about, and we just heard played out. So, anything else, Dad, you want to wrap up with?
No, I'm good.
It's a good episode.
Jimmy?
Do we
Yeah.
have another episode?
Next one's the last one of this season.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I get interesting the creative names that Dallas comes up with, and how do we see? And Dad, you've mentioned a couple times, you're like, I'm not sure I like that title on these, And this next one is humble. And I'm interested to see, and people, when you watch it, if you haven't already, does the word humble come to mind? Interesting, because again, I'm going to take you back to Matthew 5-7, and then tell me if you see humble. So, folks, thanks for with us tonight. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, either you can leave them in the comments or send an email to bob@TheDustyFeet.com. We'll be glad to address, the three of us be glad to take a look at them and talk about them. Could be fun. Everything, all the other episodes, all the other series that we have are all on TheDustyFeet.com. Feel free to go, check it out. And thanks for with us tonight. Thanks for hanging out with us on The Dusty Feet.